Please welcome me in joining Lee Krevat of Krevat Strategies and Maria Robinson, our friend from the Grid Deployment Office. Lee tends to have a much more conversational interview style, and it is much more personal and engaging than sort of a newspaper interview. And then it gets woven in with hot sauce tasting.
Karen, thank you very much. I say let's get the ball rolling with the first hot sauce.
All right, we'll just keep going.
It's smoky karma. Don't pour that much, but take a scoop.
This is like a really smart way to do it. I appreciate the thought of process here. You all know I'm a process gal.
Okay. Now, I don't think you'll have any problem with that because this isn't very spicy. Just to get in the swing of it.
Nope, that's delightful. Oh man, you all have to listen to us chew? I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, it's true.
So you've had a number of opportunities in your career where you were focused on the environment and on climate change. Can you share your pivotal moment? What made you care?
Oh, what made me care? So I went to school at MIT, and I was planning on making drugs for the rest of my life and making a lot of money doing that. Actually, one of the guys in my senior project group was part of the Moderna vaccine, and of course my mother looks at me and she's like, so what are you doing with your life while I'm here doing this? But I remember seeing for the first time the EIA graph of like energy usage over time. I was taking this class with one of my favorite professors, and it just blew my mind. I was like, there's no way that we've gone from the 1800s to where we are today, and we're using so much energy. How are we going to sustain this? What are we going to do? How is the climate going to sustain this? And we need this for our economy. And just like a light switch flicked right on, and that was the big moment for me.
And why now is it personally important to you? What's your personal driver?
Because I don't know how to do anything else? No, that's not true. I find this work so rewarding, right? I think one of the cool things about energy systems is that you could be the deepest expert in one area and not know anything about something else. And so you always have to keep an open mind, and everybody in this industry has to stay a little bit humble, because you could be the greatest distribution grid engineer and have no idea what you're doing once you get the voltage over 500, right? And so that to me keeps us all in a nice headspace, because you can always learn something new.
And those people that know about it when you don't are not ashamed to say you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, that occasionally happens too.
You have to be careful.
Yes.
How do you talk about climate change with people that don't believe the data or understand the data?
Oh, I had a conversation just this weekend with a family member sort of about this particular area. And I think the extreme weather makes it a little bit easier to talk about it with people, of just saying this extreme weather is happening. Whether you believe that human beings are the cause of it, we have to figure out how we're going to adapt. Right? I think for a long period of time, we as an industry have focused really heavily on the mitigation side, and that's still very important, but the adaptation side is growing in terms of importance with every passing day, and the resilience of our systems. Because I can guarantee, so I used to be a state representative in a previous lifetime, and much like many utility folks, I would get phone calls at 3 a.m. when people's power went out saying, Maria, my power's out, what are you doing about it? I can come over with a generator, but I have no other potential options for you right now. It's a much bigger systemic issue going on. And I can remember, I am not that old. I can remember as a kid, we would have outages all the time, and you just live with it and you accepted it, and it didn't change your life vastly. And now it is, so much of our lives depend on electricity that we can't withstand 3 minutes without electricity for any period of time. And so I think that importance continues to grow with each passing day.
Our economy, too.
Our economy.
Not just our life, personal lives.
Yes. When there was the DDoS happening, people were freaking out in my Facebook moms group about how they could not access their bank accounts or Venmo. And I was like, the same thing would happen if there was a massive power outage or a cybersecurity attack on the electric system, and you wouldn't have access to any of your money because none of you carry cash.
Yeah, you mentioned all the big weather events as a way to convince people that something needs to change. But I think it's a shame that it has come to that we couldn't be proactive, and I'm a little bit fearful that we're still not being proactive enough.
Risk mitigation is really hard for a lot of folks to determine, is it worth the extra cost now or not? My husband and I are currently having a larger discussion about life insurance. And it's like, do we do the 10-year life insurance or the 20-year life insurance? And it's really hard to sort of gauge what that's going to mean. And what we're asking people to do when they're talking about the climate is to do that, but on a much larger scale in a way that may or may not impact them in the short term. We're saying, hey, you're gonna have to maybe pay a little bit more upfront in order to see larger benefits later, right? If we invest in our electric systems now in terms of resilience and reliability, it means you might not experience 5 minutes of outages when you really need to get that work project done. That's really hard for the human mind to do the math on. And so I think, unfortunately, these much more very real weather events are something tangible that people can tend to be able to better grasp what that means for them in the long term.
This probably isn't a happy example, but I have a friend who had a dad, and they were telling him he had to lose weight and he had to stop smoking. But then once he had a very damaging health event, then he was able to suddenly do it because he saw that his life was already reduced and he had to do it.
Exactly. And I say that as someone who has a dad who we're still trying to get him to do more than his daily walk with the dog. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Let's try
Should we skip ahead a little bit?
No.
Or do you want us to keep going in order? Sorry.
Okay, look, I'm trying to you make it slow, but let's go for some good karma. Let's skip the...
So I was like stressed about this, but then I started the first one and
No,
I was
but
like,
that was
oh no.
really easy.
It was really easy, so we might as well.
We'll skip the next easy
Okay.
one, but...
Yeah. This is always my problem in everything that I do. Like, let's just skip ahead a couple steps. One of my most annoying traits is I really don't enjoy people spending time introducing themselves on Zoom calls because there are names written underneath. And so if anyone who's been, I'm looking at Larry who's been on a call, I'll be like, here's everybody from my team, and try and like get it done in 30 seconds or something. Sometimes that goes over great and sometimes it doesn't go over as well.
So here's to some good karma.
Here's to get some good karma. Cheers. I don't have a particularly high spice tolerance. That's nice too. But the first time I got COVID, all I wanted was Szechuan food. Like, that's all I wanted for like a month after I got COVID was this like hot peppers, and then it immediately went away. COVID is weird.
So that was fine, right?
That was totally fine.
It is a little bit more.
A little.
Okay.
I've got some flavor.
These three are going to jump it up, so we'll see what happens when we get there. How does the Grid Deployment Office team help mitigate climate change?
So everything having to do with the grid, and every time you try and electrify something, especially when you're talking about going from transportation, right, to electrification, it relies on the idea that your grid, one, exists, which is a big question in and of itself, but then two, is clean, right? He won't mind if I say this. So David Crane, who is my undersecretary, is a lovely human, and I am a huge fan of him. But he will tell you that he's a generation guy. He's like not a T&D guy. And I was like, but David, you have to be a T&D guy. Like you have to understand what's going on in order to understand that how the system works as a whole. And this is a conversation that we have constantly about this, because so many people think of these pieces in isolation. And part of it I do understand, right? Like as a former recovering politician, it's so easy to go out and take a picture in front of a solar field, right? It's really easy to go visit offshore wind turbines. It is so much harder to get people to come out and take a picture in front of a substation. Trust me, I've tried this like 5 times during this administration. And a lot of people are like, this just isn't cool, Maria. No one wants to think about their substations. But those are the engines that are keeping everything going in your economy. And I think helping, I've been really happy to bring in a ton of folks who weren't in government before working at the Grid Deployment Office, many of whom were doing different climate-related things previously, just to give them a taste of what it's like inside the machine and bureaucracy that is the federal government, so they understand how complex it is and what you can and can't accomplish. But I think the grid is just such a core component, whether you care about reliability, whether you care about resilience, whether you care about economic development, whether you care about climate. Like, it all comes back to the grid ultimately, and more people need to be paying attention to it. It's just hard because there's physics, and not everybody loves the physics part of it.
So what is your team specifically doing?
We have about $22 billion to get out the door.
How's that going?
It's going pretty well, actually. A lot of that is going towards major T&D upgrades or rebuilds or new projects. Some of that is going towards the hydropower fleet, right? This is another area that I think is wildly underloved is hydropower. It got less than $1 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law and in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's not anywhere close to what everybody else seem to have gotten, but is still a huge amount in order to rebuild some of our aging infrastructure. Because some of these were built 50, 100 years ago at this point. And we're trying to figure out how we can permit transmission faster and more efficiently. I think one of the things that can be really hard in building new stuff is figuring out the permitting. And part of that means you have to work with 5 different federal agencies. And working with 5 different federal agencies at once is really, really complicated if you're not inside the system. It's complicated when you're inside the system too, but especially when you're outside. So by having someone at the Department of Energy corral that process for developers and utilities, I think that's going to go a really long way to make things easier, and also putting an actual timeline on it for everybody involved.
We talked about this a little bit this morning. You didn't have to be here to know what it's going to be about, and that is the administration is about to change.
I've heard. Yes.
I'm sure you have. I think I saw your LinkedIn post. How do you think that's going to affect grid deployment?
Not that much. Part of it, I know that there are lots of people who really think about transmission in particular through the lens of a clean energy transition, and that's one way of looking at it. But you need transmission if you're going to have any sort of economic development, right? I think about, and I'm sure you've talked about this because everybody in this entire city is talking about this, data centers. This is another piece where if you're trying to do some sort of build out, you have to figure out what the grid connection is going to look like. We have to have some very in-depth conversations, both on the physics side as well as the regulatory side of how we're going to accomplish this. God bless, there was some announcement recently that I picked up in New England that said, hey, we're just going to build this enormous data center and we're just going to hook it right up to the grid. And I was like, you haven't looked at the resource adequacy reports out of ISO New England recently, have you? So we have to be able to plan that thoughtfully, but then also make sure, later on that consumers are not on the hook for something that doesn't ultimately get used for a long period of time. I feel like 10 years ago, all we did was talk about stranded assets. I feel like we haven't had a lot of stranded assets conversations in a while, and maybe just like wide leg pants is now coming back into fashion. So we can have that conversation again of what we should be doing with stranded assets.
All right, we're going to do some bad karma.
Okay. This is all Gene Rodriguez's fault, by the way. Have we said that yet?
I didn't know it was Gene's
Gene said that it was so fun to do this. And if Gene says it's fun, then it's got to be fun. One's got a little bit more of a kick going on. I can feel that.
You're tempting fate.
Part of it is my father is 72 years old, something like that, and he's eaten a bowl of Cheerios for breakfast every single day of my entire life. And he eats most of the rest of his food just like that. So for the first 18 years of my life, I also ate my food like that. So it's more of I didn't put sauces on things for a while.
You mentioned before that in another life, you had another job. Can you talk about your career, how you got to where you are now?
I graduated from college in 2009, and you might recall that there was a real wild recession going on in 2009, and it was really hard for people to get jobs. So I was very, very lucky to start at Navigant Consulting with Lisa Francis, who I'm sure many of you here know. And then I had the great fortune of going over to Advanced Energy Economy, which is now Advanced Energy United, and worked my way up there. I started like at the very bottom that you can possibly go and worked my way up to running our wholesale markets program while we were there. So that was cool to do a number of different things. We were fostering kids at the time, and I was really frustrated with the foster care system. I don't think I've met anybody who's not frustrated with the foster care system, generally speaking. And so I decided to run for office when the opportunity came up. And then in the back of my head, I always said, well, I'll run for office, so maybe someday I can be like a utility commissioner, because that seems to be like a really common pathway for how people become utility commissioners. But I think this job is cooler than being on a utility commission. Don't tell all of our friends at NARUC that, but
I think it's pretty cool.
this has been pretty fun.
You talk about interesting challenges you've had?
It's been really fun to watch this industry evolve, right? I think even just in this room right now, 10 years, 15 years ago, when I was getting started, there were not many women, not many people of color, right? And we've done a lot as an industry, I think, to really expand, and that's been great. I remember my very first internship was with Tracy, who's sitting over there somewhere, back there. And Tracy yelled at me at the end of my internship because I never asked questions, and that I needed to actually ask questions. And so then I spent all of my time thinking of what are the best questions that I can possibly ask in all of my future jobs. And so that's why I'm very annoying and ask a lot of questions now. You can all blame Tracy for that. And, you know, life happens, right? I think that's part of it too. It's not just your job part. This is something that I've felt like really strongly about in having to bring on 150 people and asking them to like leave their nice comfy jobs doing whatever it is they're doing and come into work into government where they're probably making less money and also like working a lot harder is just reminding all of our supervisors and managers like, hey, these people have lives and things are going wrong, and if they're not bringing their best selves, just you got to give everybody a break. Things can be just get in the way, and we have to work together. You know, I'm not a big fan of the like work is a family analogy because I think that's messy in its own right, but you have to be human and remember that giving everybody a break is always a good way to just operate through the world.
Yeah, I mean, empathy.
Yeah.
Understanding, maybe give people a benefit of the doubt. There's a reason to do what they did.
Yeah, exactly. And people move and have breakups and going through lots of difficult things at home. And so that's so important to me that, you know, we as a management team are always thinking about that and trying to be really clear with our team about putting themselves and their families first.
Do you have a specific setback in mind? I mean, that was really tough to get through?
Getting to this job was pretty complicated. I will say that I think I first started conversations with the administration in Easter of 2021, and I started my job at the Department of Energy in July of 2022. And so that's like a very long period of time to be thinking about what you're doing and like going through a bit of maybe we'll put you up for this job and maybe for that job and go through a Senate confirmation hearing, and then this thing happened in the Senate that has nothing to do with you, and then ultimately like, how about you end up over here in this new office and we'll hand you like a laptop and 2 people and you can figure out what to do from there. So that was, I will say I was not like my best self during that year of waiting because I'm not good at waiting, as previously mentioned. And so God bless my husband who put up with a lot of me just like trying not to pull out my hair while I was waiting around for things to happen. But of course, like all good stories, it ends with, I wouldn't change a darn thing about it now that we're here because I got to do something very, very cool, and you don't often get to say you get to like build a whole new office in a federal agency.
Are you ready to try something that's hot?
Let's start with holy moly. Sounds,
All right.
You know.
I had never had it before. It's sweet,
Okay.
but it packs a punch.
I went to Catholic school for many years, so we appreciate a good pun like that. All right, probably more than I wanted.
I
Oh
think
well.
so, maybe. Uh-oh, that was certainly more than I wanted.
Oh, it's got like the nice chocolatey vibe. First ingredient, blackberry juice. Who would have thunk?
Is it okay?
Yeah.
All right. I love it.
We'll see.
I left all the really hot ones at home.
Well, no. Like I'm feeling it. We'll see if like my mouth is still moving by the end of it, but it hasn't caught up to my brain yet.
Okay. I asked you to talk about setbacks. What's the one or two successes that you're most proud of?
Building this office in and of itself, I'm like very, very proud of. But one of the things that I think a lot of people have asked, like, what are you most proud of in this job? And it's hard because most of the projects that we're supporting are not going to get built in any near term. I'm like, call me in 10 years and I'll tell you whether I was successful. I don't really, we won't know for a little bit on it. But what I do think of as a success, and what's very cool, is the number of people who have come up to me about, especially the GRIP awards, and say like, hey, we didn't get an award or we got some subcontract here, but because we put in 50 to 100 hours putting together this application with a number of different partners, we actually decided to go forward with the project anyway and figured out a way to make it pencil. And to me, that's like mind-boggling. First of all, that people spent a lot of time and a lot of effort putting together those proposals. They were very good. But the idea that they've found, just doing that type of partnership, which people should be prioritizing, but we all know we don't have time for that, right? Like there's too many other pressing things happening. But if the federal government is dangling $1 billion in front of your eyes, then you make time for it. And to me, that is so important, that those relationships and those partnerships that were formed during this period of time will last long into the future. And they're gonna have a bigger multiplier effect, because especially some small grid technology companies, they just needed to get into the American market. They just needed to get 3 or 4 folks to take them on. And being able to do that, I think will have really good long-term impacts.
When you pull back the lens and you look at the big picture 10, 20, 30 years from now, what do you think the climate's going to look like? What do you think the grid is going to look like? Where are we going to be?
What's cool about the grid is that it's really hard to predict what that answer is going to be, right? I think it's the National Academy of Sciences wrote that like the grid is the largest machine in America and it's the most complex.
Number 1 of the century, I think.
Number 1 of the century, and part of it is just it's not a super planned situation. I live in Boston, or outside of Boston, and then whenever anyone comes to visit, they're just like, oh my God, it's not a grid. What is this nonsense, and why are there one-way streets everywhere, right? And I think of the grid kind of like that, because no one sat down and planned it. You didn't have a LaFont that came out and thought about the way it was gonna work. We're just building it as we go along, right? And that's why some of these planning processes are so important, so we're not continuing to do that. But unfortunately, there are some weird roundabouts that currently exist in the grid. All of my metaphors are getting, like, I have this whole pitch about how I think funding the grid should be like funding the national highways, because it's just as important infrastructure, and the national highways get money every single year to patch potholes. Why don't we have money every single year to fix the grid? And I feel like that metaphor continues to grow the more I think about planned versus unplanned parts of it. So to me, this is in 30 years, I'd like to think that we have a lot more automation going on. I think that's really hard. We're at this like tipping point right now, right? Part of what makes it so safe is that we have a lot of human interaction with the grid, right? We have human beings who are able to stop things along the way, who are using their thoughtful experience, and the operators are key to all of it. But there's got to be better ways to automate other processes without triggering cybersecurity concerns. And that's like a real balance that we're at right now, where either we're going to continue doing things very manually for the next 20 to 30 years, or we're going to find a way to very carefully, like this is not an all or nothing sort of situation, but very carefully automate a lot more to be able to accommodate. The fun part about regulation is, technology is moving so fast, and regulation can't necessarily always keep up with all the technology that's going on, whether it's TikTok or whether it's advanced reclosers, right? And so we have to think really hard about all of the possibilities that could come along over the next few years. I don't think any of us could have like imagined how much everyone in our lives was using ChatGPT right now, even like 2 years ago. So things are just catching on really quickly.
Anything bold? Big bold prediction?
Oh, I'm not going to give you a bold, like we're going to have an HVDC macro grid or something like that, as much as I would love to see that. I think we will definitely have a Western RTO by 20 years from now. But there's a chance I might have said that 10 years ago too, so we'll see.
You only got a few years left.
They'll get there. I feel confident.
All right, let's have another one. How was that one, by the way? You haven't said.
I mean, I can still feel that one as opposed. The other ones, like I didn't feel as I was still having conversation. But let's.
Cherry Bomb, many awards because it tastes like cherry pie, a bit like cherry pie. The other one's like kind of a sweet mustard, also.
Let's do the sweet one first, and then we'll do cherry. Cherry
Okay.
Bomb feels like a good way
Now
to.
this one's rated the highest,
The
but
highest.
but it sometimes it switches, you know.
Hold on, this one has peppers as the first ingredient.
Ghost
This one
peppers.
This one has cherries. All right, so we'll do the cherries first.
This has ghost pepper.
Sorry,
in it.
do people do this much research when they when they talk to you and read all? Okay.
Yes.
Good. I have one that I like at home called like Purple Hippo, because my friend was very into hippos for a while, so that accidentally made it into my closet and I got attached. Oh yeah, that's very cherry.
No, very cherry.
Why would you want your hot sauce to taste that cherry? What are you doing with a cherry flavored hot?
People put cranberry on turkey,
I also
so
disagree.
maybe you
with that,
put
but
this on
that's-
chicken, right?
That's one of like my very unpopular opinions is you should not be mixing the cranberry with the turkey, and it doesn't work for me.
If a standalone, then.
Yeah,
Just a
okay,
nice
just a standalone that I can respect.
What advice would you have for people that want to take a path similar as you, or people that might want to help in some way? And these are people here listening live that have the ability to help.
One is that you should definitely spend some time in government. I know it's not for everybody. I know economically it's not for everybody. But being in government is incredibly rewarding. It's really, really nice to wake up every morning and not question why you're doing something, because you're doing it for your country, for the American people. And that's true of whether you're in a political role or a non-political role. I think that is something that matters a lot. And also getting the opportunity to hear other people's complaints about everything that you do is actually very rewarding and important. Or have a child. That's another way to do that too. But for me, I am introverted. I hate going to networking events. And for me, I'm not very good at self-promotion. See my LinkedIn, which is just a bunch of reposts of things that our office is doing, right? So I don't love all of that type of work that goes on, and you can still make it. You just do good work, and people will notice. And I think having really good mentors, I appreciate all of my mentors who have looked out for me over time and encouraged me to think a little bit further. My favorite was a person who asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up. I still don't have a great answer to that, but at the time I said, I'd love to be the chief of staff to someone really important. And he's like, no, you're wrong. You should be the really important person and not the chief of staff to the really important person. And that was like a very pivotal moment that I replayed a lot and was like, do I? I will say, I'm a little bit looking forward to, I was very much a wallflower in grade school and high school. I was very popular during this period of time when we had $22 billion. So I'm looking forward to going back to being a wallflower and not being as popular and being a band kid again,
Just a final one.
All right.
Ghost Island.
I mean,
You just powered through this, no problem.
I should have trusted you and the people that work for me that said you could probably handle a higher amount of heat, Roy. That's fine. God bless them. You've all met Dylan Reed from my team, who, is one of my dearest friends in the world, who is just like, I don't know, how much are you willing to do here? And I was like,
He convinced me to take it easy on you.
yes, he did convince you to take it easy, and I appreciate that. So I'm not actively sweating in
All
front
right.
of all of you.
Cheers.
That is nice and musty.
Yeah, mustardy. And this is
one
one
of-
of my favorite hot sauces, actually.
One of our nuclear lawyers at the Department of Energy has long told me that her life goal is to be a mustard sommelier, which I did not know was a job. I did not know was a thing, but I'm looking out for her and always trying to find new mustardy things to introduce her to.
Do you have any questions for me?
Besides, what should I do when I grow up? Because I'm taking advice from anybody who is no.
I have advice.
What do you think government should have been doing over the past couple of years that we didn't get around to and should prioritize the next step?
So I'm in the industry, so it's harder because I pay attention to what the government is doing.
Yeah.
But I don't think the things that were being done got to a whole lot of people. I don't think they're aware of all the changes that have been made, the money, what it's gone to, and how it helps the country. I'm not just talking about energy now, even, just many things,
yep.
but especially with energy. And I think people need to have more, coming back to climate change, I think people need to have more than, there are a lot of weather events happening now, we better do something. There's really good, not so hard to explain science about what's happening, and I rarely meet people that understand that. I have to it only takes me a couple of minutes to explain it, and yet so few people do. And I think the government could have done more to explain what's going on in climate and all the things they've done to try.
I used to teach a graduate course on energy policy, and I'd have these lovely 25-year-olds coming in, and they're like, we are going to change the world through protests. And I was like, after 13 weeks with me, you're going to walk out with a very different tune. And after 13 weeks with me, they go, we are going to change the world by working at public utility commissions, right? But sometimes it really feels like you need that level of a graduate course for 13 weeks to be able to understand the basics. It's not an easy place to come into. And I think for a lot of Americans that are just focused on, the fact that the bus didn't come on time today and they have to figure out how to get their kid to school, which is a shockingly enormously regular thing that happens all the time, and dealing with traffic, they don't think about this. And in part because the only way that they do sometimes is because you get your electric bill, and then they go, oh man, this is going up, right? And that's the only time they really engage with energy. So part of that is getting some education in. I now talk to 5-year-olds who tell me an awful lot about climate change because their kindergartens are teaching them about it. So there's definitely an education process that's going on where I think the younger generation, Gen Alpha and so on, are going to be just really invested and thoughtful and paying more attention to what their government's doing too.
What do you think of Ghost Island?
I like it. I will say I have a lot of affection for the cherry bomb, despite the fact that it's confusing.
Because you wouldn't put it on anything.
Because I wouldn't put it on anything. No, but it's nice.
It's nice flavor. Questions from those of you that are here?
So in the theme of spice, what do you think is the spiciest issue you had to deal with at the Grid Deployment Office?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Well, I will say every time the New York Times would write about the interconnection queue, I would get a 6 a.m. phone call. And I didn't love that because it turns out solving the interconnection queue is not a thing that Maria could do in 6 months, despite being asked repeatedly if she could do that, and instead was a much bigger thing. And I think that is one of those areas where we have to figure out how to just move things and change the process. And I know FERC's done their order, but it is really one of those areas where RTOs feel like they're doing the best that they possibly can with the sheer volume of stuff coming in the door, and developers feel like it's taking forever and they're losing money with every passing day. And it feels very, very intractable. And when the answer sometimes just is, and we're working on this now, the answer is you don't have to manually email everything back and forth. That actually saves a whole lot of time if you don't just manually email everything back and forth. And so digging into things was something I liked a lot. And as I mentioned, Western RTO is not spicy either. But I didn't get super involved in that during my period of time here, though.
So my question is, we heard from Vermont that half their substations are backfeeding from the distribution grid up to the transmission grid. So how do you see regulation at the state and federal level changing? going forward to, as the grid becomes more integrated in bidirectional power flows?
Yeah, this has like been a whole thing that I've been trying to spend a lot of time. So, right, was a state legislator in what I consider to be a highly educated location, and like just trying to explain the basics of the regulatory process that we all know way too much about. The number of governors who like really just don't fully understand that they're getting power from another state, and they're like, well, how do we get the power here in our state? And doing a lot of that education. One governor I will shout out is J.B. Pritzker, who has dedicated the entirety of his time as chair of the Midwest Governors Association, focusing on interregional transmission, which is not a statement that you'd think that you'd hear, but it's Illinois. It makes sense. They're like right on a seam. But we are getting, whether it's, oh my God, what was it, 2222, and starting to see that relationship between the distribution grid and the bulk power system. So we're doing like a lot of better planning. And I think, speaking of Larry, who's here, like we're trying to do a little bit of that with our friends at PNNL right now in different parts of the Pacific Northwest to try and figure out how do these things work together long term, because we talk a good game about things like VPPs, and we talk about using DERs as much as humanly possible, but you have to be able to see into it. And there's just not a comfort level yet, I think, at the bulk power system to be able to do a lot of that. I thought you were going in a different direction of all of our substations are over 75 years old and we're really nervous about what happens next, which is a separate problem that I don't have a good answer to yet.
So Maria, first of all, let me say a big thank you to you. The GDO office infused a lot of money in our industry. So I don't know, I'm going to ask the group here a round of applause for Maria on all that effort. So as you think back now, and you talked about your experience with DOE, obviously Gene's hiding over here with the Office of Electricity and the partnerships that you had, and for me, just starting to understand many of the various segments of the Department of Energy and how large it is, how you were starting to make connections with the labs as well and with industry. Is there anything you wish would move, or thinking about going forward, that you would like to have maybe moved even faster or moved something in that direction?
So there are a couple things. One is there's definitely still a gap between where the national labs are in terms of commercialization of some of the great technologies that are there, right? It's always a little frustrating to me sometimes that the national labs are not just 5 years ahead of the utilities in terms of the technologies they have, they're 10 years, but then it's figuring out how do you actually make that available for mass adoption in a way that is user-friendly, right? Because in an ideal world, everyone's using a very similar platform that can be updated on a regular basis. And that's still an area where I think, Gene and I have had a lot of conversations about how do we close that gap and find ways to be able to do that. And I think like that defines a bit of the relationship between the labs, OE and GDO now, is like the labs come, we help fund really good ideas at the labs, in large part thanks to OE, and Gene comes up with the brilliant ideas there. And then we see proof of concept, and then we at GDO then would figure out how to fund that into a larger pilot or just a straight up deployment. I think that's something that you'll see more from our career folks who are working on this right now of how to make that triangle happen more cleanly, and we're trying to infuse some funding into that to be able to do some more of those pilots. But man, everyone's sleeping on the national labs. Let me tell you, it's one of those things that I didn't think about too much. You read an NREL study every once in a while, or something like that, or someone cites it. You have no idea the amazing science that's going on there. I think our Undersecretary David Crane took a bunch of Wall Street folks out to Idaho National Lab recently, and it was just, their minds were blown with what was going on there. And so we just need to do more of that cross-pollination of ideas, because there's some really, really cool stuff going on in government.
I also want to add thank you for your service, Maria. Having been an 8-year DOE vet, I know how at times it can be challenging.
Fun. Very good.
So my question is this: offtake agreements are one of the gating items in terms of transmission. Do you think the secretary should have or could have used her authority a little bit more to guarantee the offtake for, let's say, all the labs in California or all the federal facilities in Nevada to really stimulate the financial component for the projects?
That's such an interesting question, and also it's like, right, you've worked at DOE, so it's not as straightforward as that, because that's asking a bunch of, I mean, I'm just thinking about the contracting, my brain hurts a little bit, of how that would all operate. But, so we were able to do that where the government actually enters into an offtake agreement for a period of time to help transmission development move, and I think that will be proof of concept, right? We expect in 2026, maybe even early 2027, for some of our awardees to roll back that money into the federal government. So we'll be able to do that again. And I like to think of that as sort of a pilot project of how can we're able to move transmission by providing that offtake agreement for literally like 18 to 24 months. It's not even that long a period of time. But because the federal government's doing it, everybody feels very comfortable with us being a part of it. So how do we take that out both to the private markets and help them understand that this is a really important component of transmission development in order to get that offtake agreement, or like you're saying, some public pieces. I actually think this is something I've been noodling on for a little bit, but I actually think cities have it easier. They have such procurement processes set in place already, but cities can move a lot faster and more nimbly than the federal government can. So if they were able to group together as part of an offtake agreement, that could go a really long way, as well as getting them more invested in transmission, which is something that we continue to want to work on to make sure that local government gets invested in transmission and sees the benefits in a very real way for themselves.
Is there anything else you want to say?
Thank you for answering the phone every time we called to ask questions. Thank you for responding to the NOIs with thoughtful ideas. Like, we really did read every single one of them, and I have lots of them like plastered on the inside of my eyeballs of thoughts that we need to take forward. I know that's a lot of work, but none of this actually works without a relationship between industry and government. We could have just built all these things. We could have built GRIP in a vacuum, and let me tell you, ideas in a vacuum that aren't necessarily what folks need, right? And instead, I like to think that we were able to put out, obviously following within the congressional authorizations, but figuring out how to make it accessible for folks and what you need at this point in time, because that's what government's actually supposed to be doing. But that means time out of all of your lives, and I really appreciate that and all of your partnership. And everyone else besides me and like one other person will still be there. So you should still keep reaching out to them moving forward. Pat Hoffman will be there. Pat Hoffman will always be there. Someday I would like for Pat Hoffman to retire for her own sake, but that time doesn't seem anytime soon. So you should still reach out to them, and they still want to hear from you and keep that relationship going. And I know I speak for Jean also in saying that Gil will also be there as well. So this is just the beginning, and there's so much more to come.
Well, thank you very much for that inspirational last note. I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to wrap it up with a rap. What got you started, it was your climate itch, is the growth of energy was so much, it threw your light switch. The change in climate things aren't very brisk because it's difficult to explain to people why they should invest in mitigating risk. Your father, you said he was about 72 years old, but you don't want to spend your life just eating Cheerios from a bowl. In your first internship, Tracy gave you a suggestion that it was very, very important to ask a question. During the GRIP Awards, there were so many things so many people did, and they ended up coming up with new ideas to support the grid. You were told, don't just be a chief of staff, you can be the one. You had to wait a year to get the job. That wasn't much fun. Let's face it, Some you lose, but you win some. Thank you so much, Maria Robinson.
Cheers to you, Lee. Cheers to you. I forgot that was happening.
Thanks for being a good sport.
Absolutely. Oops.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Maria. That was a fabulous way to end the day. Although it's not over yet, there is a reception.